Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. And we do have more people registered, so they may be trickling in. My name is Rachel King. I'm the executive director of the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center here at American Ancestors. For those of you who are new to us, the Jewish Heritage Center is an archive and educational center dedicated to collecting, preserving, and exploring New England Jewish history and heritage. In addition to our archival work, we offer programs in the community here at our home in Boston and also online. And we explore not just the New England Jewish experience, but the American Jewish experience as well. Our parent organization, American Ancestors, started in Boston in 1845 as America's founding genealogical organization, and today it's a national center for family history, heritage, and culture. Just this year, we opened an expanded research and discovery center, and we hope you'll come back after this evening to explore the many offerings in this building. So tonight, we at the Jewish Heritage Center are excited, pleased to partner with the Jewish Comic Arts Foundation to present this program about one of the most influential comic artists of the 20th century. And I'd like to introduce Gina Gagliano from BCAF to say a few words.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I'm Gina Gagliano from the Boston Comics Art Foundation, and we are a local nonprofit that champions the comics art form, connects comics readers and graphic novel readers with new books, and also supports local comics creators. So we're so delighted to be partnering with the Jewish Heritage Center for this event and to be spotlighting both Will Eisner, an amazing historical comics luminary who inspires comics readers all around the world, and also Dan Mazur, who is an amazing comics luminary himself and the founder of our upcoming festival, the Massachusetts Independent Comics Expo, which is the largest independent comics festival on the East Coast and happens in Boston the first week of December. So if you're at this event because you're excited about comics and Will Eisner, or if you get excited about comics and Will Eisner, definitely come out to MICE that first weekend in December. And now I'll pass this over to Dan and to our amazing moderator, Rabbi Josh Brindell.
Thank you excellent. Thank you for making the schlep out here through the rain and the dark. I'm Rabbi Josh Brindell. My congregation is Congregation Bethel in Sudbury. I'm originally from Providence and went to Brandeis, and it is a real delight to be back on the street here in Boston. I was delighted to have been asked to come out to help moderate this event. I go by two professional titles. I'm the rabbi on the radio. I have a weekly spot on WERS on Chagiga, bringing forward Jewish music. And a lot of that comes from my interest in music as a vocalist. I'm getting over a truly nasty cold. Normally I sing tenor. And right now I'm working on my James Earl Jones impression. So don't hold me to that one. The other handle I go by is the sci-fi rabbi. And I teach a monthly class at Lair House on Judaism and speculative fiction, science fiction and fantasy. So I grew up with a profound love of comics, reading Mad Magazine and Archie comics and DC titles and Marvel titles and Will Eisner. And coming across A Contract with God and Tenement Stories when I was in Hebrew College, starting my first master's degree there, was something of an epiphany. I'd never really thought of comics and Judaism as really overlapping. And it was Will Eisner who really opened that door for me and helped me to see not only that comics could be entertaining, they could also express profound spiritual truths at the same time. It is my happy role this evening to be moderator for this august assembly and to turn it over to Dan for an introduction both to him and to his partner in crime, who produced this truly, truly excellent graphic novel. Dan?
If we go to the first slide, you will see, I don't know if this had been publicized, but unfortunately, Steve Weiner, my co-creator, could not make it tonight. So I will be playing both roles. That's what you'd see if he was here. I'm Dan Mazur. I guess, yeah, I didn't really want much of an introduction, but I do want to say that I grew up in Cambridge, bounced around the country for a bit, and have come back to live here for the last 19 years with my wonderful wife Susan and daughter Rebecca. So that's all I need to say about myself, except also I did these are some of my previous books. I did this co-wrote this book on comics history called Comics Global History 1968 to the Present, which was the first and I think still the only book that attempts to integrate the histories of comics in America, Japan, and Europe. And so I learned way too much about comics researching, writing that book. And these are my two previous graphic novels, Lunatic, a wordless book, and Hannibal Hobb and Her Horrible Heads, a fable for adults and strange children. That's how I pitch it. And then Steve, were he here, he's been until he retired recently as the head librarian at the Maynard Public Library, where he has been instrumental for several decades in promoting comics and graphic novels in libraries. He met Will Eisner in that capacity because Eisner was someone who was very interested in getting comics into libraries and graphic novels. And so Steve became kind of a Will Eisner expert. He co-wrote that book, The Will Eisner Companion, as well as these two graphic novel books and many other books. He's also written young adult novels. In fact, he has a young adult novel that came out, I think, the exact same month as the Will Eisner book, which caused him some frustrations. But so that's us, and that's Will Eisner. Now you ask a question.
So before we get to Will Eisner, how did you and Steve connect?
Good question. I'd known Steve from the Boston comics world for a few years. He'd come and moderated a panel at MICE one year about comics in libraries. And one day, I guess in late 21 or 22, he called me and he said he had a proposal for me, and we met at Zoe's on Mass Ave in Cambridge, which is sadly closed now, but I'll mention it. And he asked me if I'd be interested in drawing a graphic novel biography of Will Eisner. And I said yes long before the lunch came, because I'd been interested in and inspired by Will Eisner since I was a teen. And that's how we came together. He had a somewhat different idea from what the book became. He really wanted to do a biography of Will Eisner aimed at, maybe middle schoolers or middle grade, and really focus on his childhood and youth. And as we talked about it and went back and forth, two things happened. The book expanded to cover Eisner's whole life, and Steve and I went from writer, artist to co-writers and artists. So that's how it happened.
So what is it about Will Eisner? You said that he's influenced you. I've certainly been blown away by his work. Why a book? What is it about Will Eisner that makes him worthy of that kind of focus?
Well, assuming that some of the people in the audience aren't as familiar with Eisner as comics audiences would be, I'll go through some of the highlights of his life and what made it seem like a great life story to tell, and what makes him so important in the history of comics. So Eisner was born in 1917, the son of Jewish immigrants to New York. They bounced around with a father who could never really quite make a living. Here he is with his mother. So Eisner came. Okay, what I always like to say is, there's a famous quote by Art Spiegelman where he describes comics as the bastard child of art and commerce, which makes sense when you think how they started. So when we first started talking about this book about Will Eisner, I didn't really know much about Will Eisner's life. So I read the biographies and I thought it seemed to me suddenly that Will Eisner was the bastard child of art and commerce himself, except that he was not illegitimate child, but he was the child of art and commerce. So he had a mother who was a very practical, hard-headed woman who grew up poor, taking care of her family. Go back one second. Yes. So here he is as a kid with his mom at a push cart in the Bronx, and she's haggling over the price of carrots. So that sort of illustrates the sort of woman she was. While his father was a kind of a failed artist or an artist who never really achieved his dreams. He started as an apprentice back in Austria to a muralist painting clouds and cherubim in churches. When he came to America, he worked for a while as a set painter in Yiddish theater, but he never really made it, and he couldn't really support his family. And there's the mother complaining of this. Can you pay the landlord with talent? Can you buy groceries with art? So it was this conflict that pulled young Will between the father's sort of follow your dreams and living vicariously through his art, and the mother saying, you've got to make a living, you've got to understand business and money. So the child of art and commerce.
And those two themes really are very explicit through the book.
Yeah.
This sort of balancing act of passion and art and following your dream on the one hand, and you got to make a living, you got to be able to support your family. There's a real dynamism there.
It's really the kind of what we defined as the theme of his, not only of his life, but of the way he approached comics, because he became a cartoonist. I guess we can go a little further. He had aspirations to be a cartoonist or an illustrator. This is Will, as just out of high school, coming to New York with dreams of making it in the commercial art world, getting rejected over and over. At that time, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the newspaper comics, the newspaper business in general, and the newspaper comics, and in advertising illustration, which were really the two fields that you could go into as an artist. But fortuitously, when Will was about 19 years old, right around this time, a new form emerged. Somebody got the idea of taking Sunday funnies, reprinting them, stapling them, putting them on newsstands, and selling them for a dime. They sold like hotcakes, and they were soon running short on Sunday funnies to reprint. So they said, we need original material. So Will met Jerry Iger, one of the first publishers of all original comics magazines. And it being comic books, as they soon came to be called, being very low on the totem pole, completely disrespected, junk, fish wrap, whatever, was where young Jews made their headway into the world of cartooning and illustration. So the vast majority of people who were starting publishing comic books when comic books started around 1936, 1937, were Jewish. There was a strong connection with the Jewish underworld who controlled the newsstands. So a lot of these guys, like Jerry Iger, were scoundrels.
They shady.
Yeah, they were unethical. I mean, huge amount of energy and a little short on ethics. which happily, Will Eisner had the energy, but he wasn't as unethical as the people that he went to work for. So he meets Iger. Eventually, they go into business together to start a company that provided original material to all these content-hungry publishers. And this connects to another reason why we thought this is a great time to do a biography of Will Eisner, because it's about a young guy entering into a brand new field with no rules, based on new media, where he had to invent both the creative content and the business plan as he went along. Mm-hmm. So we felt like, well, that's got a lot of resonance with the digital revolution that's happening today. The uncertainty that all young artists face today with the collapse of most of the gatekeeping institutions and the need to kind of figure out everything for yourself, which he did. They got to work. He was very prolific, turned out a huge number of comics pages. There was conflict between Eisner and Iger, who would say things like, sure, hit the deadlines, but we're not making fine art here, Eisner. We're turning out Frankfurters. Eisner, with this desire to be a businessman and make a living inherited from his mother, but a standard of artistic creation from his father, if you want to oversimplify things, did not appreciate Iger's. Well, he learned a lot from Iger about business, but he didn't want to make Frankfurters.
But what do you attribute that to? I mean, is that artistic sensibility? Is that pride? Where do you figure that comes from in Eisner?
I mean, he was a kid who moved around constantly when he was young. The father was always, moving the family one step ahead of the landlords. And he was a kid who found refuge in literature and libraries, in the pulp magazines of the time. I mean, I think he just, had whatever it is that makes somebody an artist from the beginning, really.
So the passion.
Yeah, that passion and that excitement. But he also really internalized, the lesson of seeing his mother so, constantly full of anxiety, and he did amazingly well at it. I mean, he starting this company. He soon they expanded, and he had, again, I don't even think he was 20 years old yet. Hired a room full of artists and eventually writers, and kind of invented this new studio system for making comics. And he did very well. I mean, but before he went off to the war in 1942, so he was just 25 by then, he bought his parents, who'd never, who'd just been moving around from tenement house place to in the Bronx. He bought them a beautiful apartment on Riverside Drive. I mean, he supported his family for the whole rest of his life, and always, made art. If we can call comics that.
I think we can.
Yes. Okay. So he invented the studio system. He really created, talking about business models, the system of making comics that became the industrial model through really up until the present, separating the tasks between writers, pencilers, inkers, colorists, and this kind of assembly line.
The book goes into some detail on that, and I had no idea that he wasn't just a fine writer and artist, but he also had this sort of artistic, I guess, assembly sensibility.
Yeah.
And he was able to think very granularly about the output itself. This might be more of a Steve question, but I know a little bit about manga, and I know that, again, you divvy it out in much the same way that American comics are divvied out. Mm-hmm. Where did this idea come from with Eisner? Did he see this with the cars and assembly lines and just transferred?
I mean, I'm sure that was in
abroad.
That was, the culture was steeped by then in the assembly line, the idea of an assembly line.
So the whole Ford revolution.
I mean, that was a huge part of the American success story. But again, I think he just, you know, I've never read anything where he explained how he thought of it. It was almost like it was this natural thing. And I think again, he was so young. He was driven by necessity.
Right.
He was starting out in a field that hadn't existed 2 or 3 years earlier, and he just came up with a way to do it. You know, Iger thought he was crazy, and it really worked. And
Oh, this is fascinating.
he was artistically restless. I mean, the other thing about Eisner is, and this really surprised me when I read how, you know, within 2 or 3 years of comic books not existing, he already had this idea that comics shouldn't be just for children, and that they could exist on the level of fine art and literature. So in about 1939, he was offered this opportunity by one of the big newspaper comic syndicates to basically do whatever he wanted. Comic books were selling, and they saw it as a threat to their readership.
Right.
So they had this idea to do a comic book insert into the Sunday paper, and they went to Will Eisner, you know, all 22 years old, and said, "Do whatever you want." They were expecting Superman, because Superman and Batman were what had sort of put comic books on the map.
That was the juggernaut.
Yeah. They didn't realize that Will Eisner, the one way in which he really stood apart, I think, from everybody else in the comic book business, was he hated superheroes. He thought it was dumb, and he did not want to do that. So he went off and said, "I'll take the job." He walked away from the Iger Eisner studio, which was very lucrative, sold out to his partner, and took this incredible risk. And he created this character called the Spirit. Originally, it was just a detective whose name was Denny Colt, and what he wanted to do was to use a detective format, just to tell different human stories each week, obviously with a crime and a mystery. And when he took this proposal back to the syndicate, they said, "Where's the costume? Where's the cape?" And he said, "Well, I'll give him a mask, and I'll give him, how about gloves?" And they were like, "Okay." And he came up with a kind of a fun, cheesy origin story where the guy gets killed, or he's taken for dead and buried, but it's a premature burial, and so he's able to come back as the kind of, everyone thinks he's dead, and he just has a secret identity and called him the Spirit. So, the Spirit was pretty successful. It ran in a number of papers for, I guess, 13 years. But its commercial success was really outpaced by the creative influence that he had on generations of cartoonists. He went to war. He went to the army. Didn't actually go to the war. He never went overseas in World War II. His talents were recognized by the military, and he was recruited to do poster campaigns about preventative maintenance. The army was very concerned that soldiers weren't reading their manuals for their equipment, and so they said, well, maybe comics. So he did posters and comics, created this character called Joe Dope, who was a dope, and who kept getting in trouble because he didn't maintain his equipment. And by whatever standards the military had, this was a very successful campaign. So he came back after the war. He went back. He did the next 7 years on the Spirit, which really was where I think the height of the creative genius that he put into the Spirit came out. And then that kind of fizzled off. and he basically vanished from the scene for nearly 20 years. If by the scene you mean the comic book industry, he took what he sort of learned working for the military and started a company that made instructional comics, educational comics, working for the military again, working for corporations, and doing good quality work that nobody in the comic book business and comic book fandom, which was developing over those years, knew existed. But in the early mid '60s, some of the old Spirit stories started to get reprinted, and he didn't even realize that there was a new generation of cartoonists who were thinking he was the greatest. They didn't know what became of him. So in the late '60s, he was invited back to go back one, to one of the early comic conventions in New York, and he realized from what he saw there that comic books had changed, been in it, and there was this opportunity to do something new, which is his vision, finally sort of trying to realize that vision of comics as a literary art form. His first effort was A Contract with God. Not the first graphic novel. He did not coin the term graphic novel, but he championed it and really was the first to create a book-length comic that was published as a book, not as a newsstand comic. And he kept that up for the rest of his life. That was 1978. He lived till 2005, and he drew 20 more graphic novels. So does that answer your question?
It absolutely does. And I'm going to ask you another one too.
Yeah.
Because what you're sharing here and what was so, again, clear in the book was not only was he an innovator, he was someone who kept innovating.
Yeah.
And he also stayed in the game long enough to watch it change several times. The way that society viewed comics, first of all, as this sort of almost underground art form, to literally underground comic,
Right.
to what became a literary
Yes.
mode here.
He definitely saw that happen. I mean,
It was part of it.
yeah. I mean, when I did that comic book history of comics, I kind of felt like, I mean, I was born in 1959, but I felt like the way one's personal history extends back a couple decades through your parents and whatever, I felt like I kind of lived the entire history of comic books almost. And Eisner really did. He saw it from before the beginning to at least the beginnings of its next phase. And that was the one of the things that I think both Steve and I also made us feel like this is a story that is kind of humanly important as well as a history of comic books. Was, if you go to this next slide, it was following this character who from a very early age had this drive and determination to succeed financially, artistically, and did. And then at the age of 60, when he didn't have to, he was doing fine. He took another risk, just like he did with the Spirit. So at the age of 60 or 61 years old, he's pounding the pavements, trying to sell A Contract with God. The publishers don't have any idea what a graphic novel is. He's totally going on faith, saying this will work, this will work. There he's saying to his wife, I feel like I'm 19 years old again, and not in a good way. And not only did he sell that book and publish that book, he kept at it, as I said. And the idea that at age 60, he started a whole new creative career, and not only a new career, he created a new field,
Right.
just as he had in his late teens. And to me, that was very inspiring. Like the drive of the kid to succeed is like, that's the book that we started with, for young readers, and it's like, then this is the book for for old readers.
I'm going to sort of let my Rabbi Kippah show for a moment here. When we were talking about this the other day, I was remembering Rabbi Akiva, who started his rabbinic studies at age 40. You know, Rabbi Akiva, the great one. So
Yeah.
I'm sort of seeing that here again. Like it's almost like it's almost like he didn't become Will Eisner until he was 60.
Yeah.
Like the father of
Yeah.
the graphic novel. I know not literally, but still that's
And he
think
never,
of it.
it was like there was something that he started in his 20s and he didn't get the chance to finish it. But when that chance came in his 60s, he took that chance and he was just as ready and just as alive to the excitement of it as he'd been as a young man. So that was kind of nice.
Something was interesting to me, sort of jumping ahead a bit, but thinking about our conversations is that in a lot of his graphic novels, that's when a lot of the more overt Jewish themes come out, which are not there at all, obviously in the earlier works, because that wouldn't sell. You're trying to assimilate and be as white bread as possible. Yeah, contract with God, and we were talking about the plot, we were talking about Fagin the Jew. A lot of these Jewish themes came out later in life. Is that something that you, any thoughts on?
Well, you know, as I was saying to you yesterday, it was kind of like the people who started the Jewish people who started the comic book business were a lot like the Jewish creators of the Hollywood studio system, in that they hid themselves, or at least hid their Jewishness, in the work that they created, whether it was the studio bosses or the directors. You know, very little Jewish content made by all those Jewish creators. So, and there's a scene in the book where where all these, they're not all Jewish, but they're pretty much all immigrants. They're mostly Jewish. There's an Italian guy, and they're in the studio and they're working, and they're all talking about what they should change their names to. You know, so Jake Kurtzberg became Jack Kirby, and Eisner didn't change his name, but you know, they were just, whatever it was about that generation or those generations that they knew not to put their Jewishness in their work.
Right.
And then
he did ultimately.
He did ultimately, and I think maybe that was something, you know, when he came back around and started doing graphic novels, you know, I think his feeling was a comic is something that the creator should put their whole self into. And so, and he's putting his life and what he's seen and what he's experienced, and obviously, especially going back to his childhood, there was a lot of Jewishness in that. And then I think also there's just sort of a personal thing that I think happens to a lot of people. He was a secular Jew, as far as I know. I've never seen that his parents were observant, or I don't even know if he was bar mitzvahed. I relate to that. You know, and then as he's older and he's had more, you know, more of life's hardships coming to him, I think he just turned both to his traditions, the traditions of his people, and to maybe more of a spiritual side. So, yeah.
As we, like, Paul Simon has been doing that. Leonard Nimoy did that. So not unusual for an artist then to bring up some of their deep roots.
Yeah, so I think that was just, that there's a universalism to that.
What else have you got?
Let's see, what's next?
Oh yeah.
How did we make this book? So Steve and I worked together in what we kind of jokingly called the Marvel method, which is where, as Stan Lee worked with his artists, he would just give them an outline, and they would you know, break it down onto the page and put in the dialogue, send it back to him. He'd make the dialogue worse and get the writer credit. But we worked that way in that we never really scripted. You know, most comics when they're collaborative, there's a script that's a lot like a movie script. So we outlined in detail together, sending a Google Doc back and forth, or going back and forth on the Google Doc, and then I would draw and put in some dialogue and send it to Steve, and he'd change the dialogue if he wanted, or we'd argue about it. But I do have some slides here that are just, I forgot my slides. The first thing was when we started talking, since we knew we were going to have to really come to a meeting of the minds, was really had to do with what we were reading. The first step of that obviously was reading everything available about Will Eisner. There are a couple really good biographies. Will Eisner also did a couple of semi-autobiographical graphic novels of his own, which we knew we'd be covering a lot of that same material, and had to be kind of audacious to say we'll do it as well or better than it himself. And then we had to next slide. Then we had to talk about what is this book going to be like, and really the way we did that was talk about other graphic novel biographies that we admired. This is one by a manga artist named Yoshihiro Tatsumi, whose role in manga is somewhat parallel to Eisner. And what we both really liked about this was that it integrated the story of his life, his youth becoming a manga artist, also with the history of Japan and what was going on at the time. Mm-hmm. Another that we liked, Kiki of Montparnasse, by a team of artists. Cattell Mueller is the artist, and I don't even know Bouquet's first name. And they've done a bunch of creative graphic novel biographies. They did this one of Kiki, who was kind of a muse and model for Man Ray and other French artists in Paris in the 20s and 30s. They did one about Alice Guy, who is one of the first filmmakers, French filmmakers, film directors, and they did one of Josephine Baker. And these novels just had a very nice way of fictionalizing these lives. I mean, by which I mean not making stuff up, but
and we're being prompted to draw this section to a close so we can do some Q&A. So
okay, let's draw this section to a close.
Or reference.
I did want to point out, since we're here in the Jewish Heritage Center, that these books of Jewish life in New York were also really important to us. So yeah, we can go to Q&A. Yeah.
So we're throwing it open for you, questions or observations that you'd like some reflections on. We're here for you.
You talked a little bit about how the sort of the Jewishness is. Talked a little. Sorry, I'm already loud as it is. Talked a little bit about how the Jewish content came later in terms of like themes and story moments in Eisner's career. I'm wondering if there was anything that you would identify as Jewish that is sort of stylistic in how he put together the work, what his art style was like, what kind of dialogue people had. And I'm also curious if you think there's anything in your work that is kind of Jewishly inflected, in addition to the themes that you write about.
That's a good question. The spirit was a big square-jawed, snub-nosed He-Man detective named Denny Colt, but Jules Pfeiffer, who worked for Eisner on the spirit, is often quoted as saying, "We all knew the spirit was Jewish." Which, to be honest, I can't quite figure it out. But I mean, there's that whole idea that comes up with Superman a lot, of Superman as the immigrant hiding his real identity, and
I can do a Moses 1 for 1 straight on down.
Yeah, and I don't really know if that applies to the spirit, since he really only put the mask on at the insistence of his publishers. It's really hard to say. I mean, the comic book visual storytelling vocabulary was so much created by Eisner, Kirby, Kurtzman, at least for what we inherited by the end of the 20th century, that it's hard to say. It's hard to say there isn't something inherently, Jewish about it, but it's hard to identify it. I mean, I don't know how to answer that question, or for myself either.
I'll give you one observation, which is when we're talking here, pretty much like the 1920s to 1960s, we're still thinking of Jews as an outsider, as the other, not at all like today, where we're talking about the 5 o'clock shadow phenomenon, where you'll work with someone who's Jewish, but you won't socialize with them. What I'm seeing in Eisner's work, and I'm curious what you would say as a real expert here, is the perspective of the outsider.
Mm-hmm.
And if there was anything Jewish, I would say, in the early comics or in Eisner's work, it's that someone who doesn't quite belong, and yet someone who's so deeply invested in the society in which they live. So here you have the spirit who, for all intents and purposes, is dead, and yet, tzedek tirdov, he's completely invested in this idea of justice and working to make the world a better place. And we see that again and again. There were references to the creation of other superheroes in the book. So here you have Batman, who, again, wealthy, looking very waspy on the outside, and yet that's not who he really is. He himself sees himself as an outsider, not even as Bruce Wayne, but as Batman, working to make society
lost
better.
his
Exactly.
connection with his parents, who killed in front of him.
So that's the one commonality that I'm seeing in a lot of Jewish artists of that generation. I wonder what you make of that.
I agree with that. And I think another thing not all the spirit stories, but some of the spirit stories that are the best and most celebrated don't really involve the spirit as much. And they focus on some little guy who works in an office or who's a milkman, and these sort of humble characters who sort of stumble into a violent or criminal situation or do something heroic that no one ever realizes that they did. Again, I don't want to say how Jewish is that, because I think that's the universal theme, but I'll just put it out there as something I think that always was a big concern to Eisner in his work, is to sort of see these events, heroic things happening from a very small, little guy point of view. Not even necessarily outsiders, but the downtrodden and humble.
Mm-hmm. The Volk.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think that kind of what I've heard here about your biography of Will Eisner and his career and then his life story and then 20th century Jewish experience, it kind of really makes sense to me as a reader and a Jewish person in the assimilation story. It just really makes sense to me a lot about, okay, you immigrate to New York, your parents are foreigners or, immigrants. And then here you are, this, maybe this lonely, Jewish kid, and you're starting out and you want to assimilate, and the Jews are running the newspapers or Hollywood. And so it's like, even like a Jewish woman invents Barbie doll. All the products are for, to make money.
Right.
So how do you make money? Your work is goy initially.
Irving Berlin.
Yeah,
Right.
so much. I mean, there's a ton of these examples. And then I think it's really neat the way he was in the military and he's doing the practical and the educational stuff. Education is a big theme in the Jewish culture. And so he like drops out, he's doing all this educational stuff. And then he blossoms, he's like, okay, now I can do my work. And he's, launches his real artistic stuff with sort of a new literary genre of graphic novels, right? And he starts with that, and then he concludes with like the plot or the Protocols of Zion or whatever.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
he really has to. And then the early stuff about the spirit. I can see. You see that. I mean, I haven't read this. I think I've seen some of this, a little bit of his work, and it seems that graphic novels are a great way for those of us that don't want to read a lot, but you can learn about different cultures and grasp a lot in the comic book format. And so I think not now you see all these other cultures, Japanese or Iranian or whatever they're doing, French, whatever they're doing, this stuff where talking about, different cultures in the melting pot of America. So, but that spirit also, I really see in like the 40s and the 50s, Jewish men, they're young, they're coming of age. They want to be macho too, but they cannot be the mainstream macho. So they got to be a little macho in another way. Like that one character of the spirit was like a real dandy looking guy, the outfit and everything, but not the classic kind of macho. So it's alternative macho. That's just what I would say.
Alternative macho.
Alt
Everything you
macho.
explained made perfect sense to me.
And it's interesting too that I always take pains not to continue the myths, which Eisner was perfectly happy to promote himself, that he created the first graphic novel, that he coined the term graphic novel, and credit to him is due for really for pushing it. But I think that it didn't really take off as a form until Mouse. And Mouse, I think, for a number of reasons, was the book that made everyone take graphic novels seriously. And that was followed by things like Persepolis and Fun Home. So
Or
the
Batman,
different cultures.
The Dark Knight Returns. too.
That's true. That's true. But that's there's like two threads of graphic novels. There's like the literary graphic novel that comes more out of underground comics, and then the mainstream superhero comics that get more literary.
Right.
And they kind of meet in the middle.
To the point that was raised, my mother's a Latin teacher, so I grew up reading 1010 in
Latin?
yes. God help us. But when we went to the Strand, I bought it in English. Actually, she would buy all the ones that I wanted in Latin, but the English ones I had to do with my own money. So in France, the
At least
graphic,
at Asterix in Latin.
I mean, it was all there. Oh, and the puns. Oh God, the puns. So wow, that took me back. So what I'm saying is that in Belgium and in France, graphic novels have been an accepted art form for decades before we even got to them.
But they didn't realize it, is the thing. I mean, the ground had been set, but when Mouse first came to France, it was a revelation to them.
Really, in France too.
Yeah, and I think almost more because of the format than the content, because they were in this very rigid album format. So after Mouse, all these alternative French publishers started to emerge, and they use the term graphic novel.
Fascinating.
Graphic novel.
So a format shift.
Yeah, it was like format was really important.
Do we have time for one more, or are we at time?
And I have copies of the book over here.
Yeah.
I will sign if you'd like
Strongly
one.
recommended.
So that's what I was going to say is if you want to learn more, Dan will be signing and selling copies of the book. So thank you so much, Dan and Rabbi Josh. That was fascinating. There's clearly so much more to discuss.
More slides.
So we'll have to have a part 2 and definitely read the book. I also want to invite you. We pulled out a few things from the Jewish Heritage Center archives with we have a comic strip, long-running comic strip in the archives Also, you mentioned that he was influenced in the military, but with these instructional manuals and so we have the collection of Building 19. If you remember Building 19, and the ads and the circulars were all done in this sort of comic book style, and there was
That circular is amazing.
Yeah.
You know, it opened up. It's like so much graphic
yeah,
energy and humor on those pages.
including
With Will Eisner.
including some gentlemen with fedoras, and they look very similar to the spirit. So anyway, we welcome you to take a look at our materials. I also wanted to mention that the Jewish Heritage Center has more programs coming up. There's a little flyer on your seats. I did want to mention that we will be having an event again in this room a week from tonight about the history of combined Jewish philanthropies here in Boston, which was the first Jewish federation in the country. That will be a program about its early history and also a little bit about the history of Jews and philanthropy in this country. So we welcome you back. And you can see the other programs here. And also, please, we invite you to learn about the Jewish Heritage Center on our website, jewishheritagecenter.org. Thank you so much to our partners at Boston Comic Arts Foundation, to our speakers. Thank you to our colleague, Ginevra Morse, running tech, doing a fabulous job as ever. Thank you. We hope we'll see you again, and enjoy the rest of your evening.